when Neo disconnects from the machine, all of a sudden he's lost the whole life he had before. That's the cost of freedom. And this is why Jesus says that we cannot live by faith if we do not give up all that we have. This is part 3, what it means to be free. What's the freedom the Bible offers us? And maybe you remember that I promised that part 3, we would start to look at church history and making sense of it through the same lens of this great controversy. However, I realized afterwards that there are some critical concepts that need to be covered first. Before we can unpack and sort truth from error in church history, we need to just understand more fully the basics of how salvation works and is received on an individual level. The first proposition, we covered 10 in part 1 and 10 in part 2, so now we're at 21, is that we are not in control. We're not as free as we think we are, especially, and this is especially evident when we examine our moral selves. What this means is that when we make a decision, we might feel like it's our decision, but it's actually mostly our internal wiring responding predictably to the world around us. We are not really in control. I'll give you an example. When you chose your outfit this morning, you felt like you were making a real decision, but your choices of clothing were determined by your culture, your available clothing, your tastes, your feelings, probably some TV commercials or magazine ads, childhood memories, your self-image, maybe even a comment or advice from your spouse. And all these things you don't really have control over. You know, let's face it, most of us came here looking like kind of how we look like each week. We are predictable for this reason. And as I look here, you're all sitting where you should be seated at your normal places. We are predictable. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually good that we're predictable. And it's part of how God designed us, but it's something we should be aware of. While I was on vacation, I read this book by neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, explaining all the reasons we are not free. Now, he's coming at this from a materialistic, atheistic perspective, so I don't accept his conclusions entirely, but there is a lot of interesting science that can't be ignored. And you can get the gist of his ideas on various YouTube podcasts, including a 1-hour interview with Alex O'Connor. His basic thesis is that if we break down all of our choices and decisions in life, we can observe that they are the product of a host of different factors going on inside of our brains, which we don't really have control over. One of the examples he gives is childhood trauma. A child raised in a traumatic setting is going to have far less motivation, emotional regulation, impulse control than a child raised in a healthy home. And the child, of course, has no control over this. And there's a lot I could cover, but for time's sake, I'm just going to summarize some of the other factors, unconscious factors in our decision-making are our life experience, our upbringing, our culture, our personality, our hormones, our habits, our brain structure, our genetics. These are all things we don't have meaningful control over or direct control over because they're either kind of secondarily been influenced by these things. Like our habits, of course, we can form our habits, but they tend to be the product of the habits of people around us and other things that we don't control. Now, you might say that doesn't matter so long as we have the feeling that we're making a decision. That's all that matters. And maybe that's partially true. There's clearly a difference between choosing your own outfit and someone else making you wear it. So some philosophers have argued that regardless of what's happening in our subconscious, and if we consciously feel totally in charge of what's going on in our brain, if we consciously feel like we're making a free choice, then we are free for all the reasons that actually matter. And that can seem convincing until we consider our moral actions. Because in the moral department, we are not truly free. In the moral department, we fall short of our own ideals. We do things that seem to go against what we want to do. For some, it's addiction or compulsive behavior. Or you might find yourself losing your temper, not understanding why. You yell at your spouse or your kids. Or it's dishonesty. You tell your kids they shouldn't lie, but you sell your car and you lie about it. Or you lie to the government to save taxes. And you have all kinds of different ways that we fall short of our own moral ideals of the kind of people we want to be. The more you are trying to live up to some kind of moral standard, the more that's going to become painfully obvious to you. And so we find ourselves agreeing that we are not in control. In Galatians 5:17, Paul summarizes our limited control over ourselves this way: for the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. And Paul has more to say. In Romans 7, starting in verse 15, he writes, "For what I am doing, I do not understand. What I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For the will is present with me, but how to perform what is good, I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" So Paul recognizes that we are slaves to these unconscious forces that direct us to make decisions we don't want to make. And that's our natural state. And modern history has demonstrated this in powerful ways. We've seen how entire nations can flip in one generation under the right circumstances. Perhaps the most dramatic example was Germany in the 1930s. Did people in Germany at that time all decide to become these evil psychopaths that would kill a whole population of Jews? Or did they simply act the way humans predictably act in those specific circumstances? But if that's uncomfortable to think about, it means that although you might think that you are a good, rational person, without God's intervention, you're just as much a genocidal Nazi in hibernation, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. People move like sheep with the current trends. The reason people move in unison like this is because they're all being subjected to the same conditions and mostly respond in predictable ways. Another fascinating example is North Korea, an entire country under the grip of one family. They didn't all independently choose to be slaves like this. They are being controlled by cultural and social factors they are not able to overcome. Obviously, there's political repression. But Kim Jong-un and his predecessors could not hold power if the majority were not giving it to them. If humans were fully free and autonomous, rational beings who could not be so easily manipulated, a place like North Korea could not exist. So this brings us to proposition number 22, fear and sin. What is it? How does this work? What is it that drives this slavery of our natures? Our slavery to our fallen moral natures stems from our existence in a state of existential fear over our mortality. And this comes from Hebrews 2:14 and 15, where Paul says, "Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage." Now, for a long time, I struggled with this passage, especially in my younger years, because it seemed to me like, specifically for someone with my personality who liked to take risks, fearing death was a good thing. It helped me avoid certain sins and other bad decisions. For example, I would avoid drinking and driving because I could kill myself and others doing it. So there's lots of unhealthy behaviors that I will avoid to avoid death. So fear of death, at first glance, doesn't seem to be so bad. But that's not the kind of fear Paul is talking about here. Paul is not talking about understanding death and how to avoid senseless follies that accelerate it. He's talking about the fear that leads people to compromise their conscience and live as slaves of fear and cynicism. In North Korea, in all the repressive regimes, everything is held together by fear and bribery. You have the most powerful at the very top, and they give incentives of fear and bribery to those at a level of power just beneath them. And then these give the same incentives of power, of fear and bribery to those beneath them, and so forth down the totem pole. So Kim Jong-un doesn't need to single-handedly terrorize his entire nation. He just needs to terrorize and bribe his generals. And they terrorize and bribe their commanders. And they terrorize and bribe their majors. And so far down the line until the whole country lives in terror. And a key part of this is the atheistic state philosophy called Juche. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly because I don't speak Korean, but it's a philosophy developed by the founder, Kim Il-sung, North Korea's founder and eternal spiritual president. It says, let us embody the revolutionary spirit of independence, self-reliance, and self-defense more thoroughly in all branches of state activity. And so this is the philosophy, self-reliance. This radical self-reliance is the philosophy. And this whole regime is built on what is exactly the opposite of faith. It's built on self-reliance. And because we are so small and helpless, self-reliance is a one-way ticket to a life of terror and slavery to the powerful. And that's the problem. When you think you're self-reliant, you're basically just this little tiny person alone in the universe relying on yourself. That's just a guaranteed recipe to live in fear. And going deeper than that, without faith, death strips life of any objective meaning because everything we do will ultimately amount to nothing given enough time. So as Paul puts it, all that's left is to live for selfish ends. If the dead do not rise, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And so that's the basic anatomy of our problem. And when you live that way, if you live under the fear of death that way without faith, you're basically a slave of your circumstances. The difference between you and a 1940s Nazi or a modern North Korean or a drug addict is just luck. It's just luck. You're not in control of where you're going to end up if you're living in the flesh, if you're living by fear. It's just what the circumstances around you happen to be. And so your slavery to fear is simply holding you differently from others. And there's all kinds of ways we can be held. It holds us in all kinds of ways. It's really just different expressions of one thing. And this is Paul's diagnosis of the human race. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their way, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And you can actually go online and learn about the school of social psychology called terror management theory, which is a framework that analyzes all the moral behavior through the lens of our existential fear of death. And it's quite fascinating and complex, and there's lots of different opinions about it. But it's interesting how modern psychology still supports the central biblical truth of how the fear of death drives people. Now, the question arises, maybe you remember part 2 of the series, if fear of death is what holds us in bondage to sin, then why does the Bible present death as part of God's plan to save us? Right? You might remember this from part 2. It was a major theme that God has placed us under death so that we could be humbled and have a chance at salvation. We covered verses like Psalm 90:12. So teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Another verse, Ecclesiastes 7:2. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. So which is it? Is being confronted with our mortality something that holds us in sin, or can it help us free us from sin? Well, it's both. The terror of death will keep you in bondage to sin, but the understanding of death and its place in God's plan and the contemplating death And the reason for it intelligently can help set you free from sin by faith. It's kind of like how a radiation causes cancer, but properly used with understanding, it also helps to cure it. Another example is snake antivenom. So when we were in Costa Rica, I had the chance to see a pit viper. It's the most deadly snake in South America. And we learned how the antivenom is made with the venom. Death is very much like this. God is using the venom and making antivenom. He's using the radiation and treating us with it. And faith is the key to the difference. By faith, we can discern that death and destruction we are under in this world is carefully controlled by God. So by faith, the reality of death and the terror that it brings can bring us to the realization of our just condemnation and need for repentance and faith, and can contribute to our salvation when combined with hope of redemption and God's purpose. If you remember, the ultimate source of sin is pride. Fear is the consequence. Fear is the consequence that follows sin and then keeps us in slavery. That's been a major theme of this series. Pride breaks our faith in God, and the inevitable result is a life of fear. Even if we were immortal, we would still live in fear if we were living in pride and independence from God. Death only comes to make the fear more potent, more present. And so pride is the seductive allurement, but the inevitable result is always a life of fear, because being cut off from God, we are held in terror. And we see that very clearly with the North Korean regime, how the philosophy of self-reliance has created a nation of people too afraid to stand up for themselves. Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously declared that God is dead, concluded as a result that the greatest force in the universe is the will to power. If you don't have faith in God of love, it's you against everyone else. And you have no control over where in the totem pole you will end up. A finite being without faith is grasping for knowledge and trying to find power in the universe. And that's a terrifying way to live. However, being under the understanding of our temporary death by faith, we can be saved from sin. And that's because the pronouncement of our death came after the promise of our redemption. There was never a time when the human race was abandoned to death without also being given the promise of hope. And so, as we look at the grave, we can either see only evil and misery and darkness and be held by it under the power of sin, or because of Christ, we can look at the grave with faith and see incredible love and goodness of a God who is using death as medicine to save us from a fate worse than death, which is the fate of an endless existence lost in hopelessness and moral darkness, where we are separated from the love of the infinite God and are left in endless quest for knowledge and power. That's the terrifying existence of Satan and the fallen angels right now. Having rejected faith, all that's left is this quest for power. And that's why the ultimate final destruction of all evil, including Satan and his angels, is not an act of punishment as much as it is an act of mercy. Ultimately, there's only mercy and goodness with God. And as we covered in part 1, the only way for genuine trusting love to truly exist is for everyone to exist under the protective authority of a benevolent, all-powerful God. It's not the quest for power that holds the universe together, like Friedrich Nietzsche says. It's faith in the love of God. As finite beings, you cannot live without fear if you cannot live through faith. If we do not have something to trust that can anchor us, we are living in fear. In a world where we are completely unrestrained by God's authority, everyone is completely free to do whatever they want, and you cannot trust anyone, and so you will be afraid. So the ironic outcome is that in a place where everyone can do whatever they want, no one is free. Instead, we're all terrified of each other and slaves of selfishness as a result. And in such a world, relationships, all the relationships that exist are based on domination and hierarchy. Every relationship is transactional and strategic to rise on the dominance hierarchy. And those at the very top often go to some very dark places because they have nothing to inhibit them any further. And we've seen this with the Epstein files recently, haven't we? We also see this with the lives of many of the rich and powerful all the time. And this is how much of the world is today. We're trapped in this reality through the power of death, which hold us under the power of sin through fear. But the power of death also has the benefit of making us long and hope for something better. Proposition 23, faith is the key. Faith in God is the most powerful and important choice that could be given to us and is the key that opens the way for the kind of freedom we want, the freedom from fear. So far, we've learned how we're not fully autonomous beings. In our natural state, we're basically acting out predetermined consequences of our circumstances. The only difference between you and a drug addict, a prostitute, a Nazi, a slave of Kim Jong-un is circumstance. That's it. You might think you're this pretty good person, but you're not good. You're not smart. You're just lucky. But what if you have been given one choice that can override who and what you are and can make you truly free? Free from fear, free from the power of evil. The good news is we have that choice is faith. John, the evangelist, opens his gospel with this powerful recognition of the power of faith by claiming that by faith we can be given power to overcome what we are and become something completely different, a child of God. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And John continues in his epistle. He writes it even more clearly, for whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. And in verse 19, we know that we are of God and the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. So I'm not making any of this up. All of this is clearly taught in the scriptures. And Jesus, of course, comes to us with these powerful invitations to rest in him. In Matthew 11:28-30, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. But this rest is not some absolute anarchic freedom. We aren't free to do whatever we want. That's not freedom. That's anarchy. What Jesus offers us is freedom from fear, freedom from having to live under the tyranny of our own natures. We are free to live in loving community with others of mutual love and support. God gives us the freedom to live as we were designed to live, and that's really the only freedom there is. A fish is not free by being free of water. A fish is free in water. We're free within God's will. That's the only freedom there is. And so Paul says that instead of being slaves of evil, we can become slaves of righteousness. We don't get ultimate autonomous freedom. That's just not an option for us. Only an infinite God can be fully free. You'd have to be all-powerful to be fully free, which is why Jesus said that only God is good. But you've been given a choice. Whom will you serve? Choose carefully. You can either choose to serve self and be a slave of your circumstances, of your nature, of your flesh, or you can choose to serve God by faith. This is an image here. It's kind of an illustration of what I'm talking about. When we went to Costa Rica, I didn't get the choice to fly the plane. I got the choice to decide where I'm going and to choose the airline, right? And so that's the choice we're given. We get to choose our pilot, and that's pretty much it. You can be a slave of evil or a slave of righteousness. And one of the most loved illustrations of this comes from Jesus' analogy of the vine in John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. There's no freedom from evil apart from faith in God. So although both the Bible and human experience present us as being these beings with very limited agencies, and it's so interesting that science confirms everything I'm saying, that we don't have as much freedom as we subjectively feel like we do on a daily basis. We have been given this one choice that matters most, whether to merge our will with the will of God by choosing faith. And when we do that, then it becomes God who works in us to will and to do his good pleasure. And so faith is this key that psychologically gives us the power to overcome sin, and it's the key to living by the Spirit. And the Spirit, beyond just giving us freedom from fear, fills us with the love of God. And so in a few places, Paul gives us this clear link between living by faith and the Spirit. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Then in Galatians 6:8, he who sows to the flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit gain everlasting life. And now, proposition 24. The powerful truth of righteousness by faith is that our entire reality can be redefined in accordance with God's promise rather than our subjective experience of being under death and sin. Now, in the movie The Matrix, this very culturally significant movie, The main character, Neo, finds out that humanity is not truly free. And ultimately, when he accepts that reality and takes the red pill, he becomes empowered to live by different rules. He's no longer a slave. And today we hear this expression in pop culture a lot. To be red-pilled is an expression for having our eyes opened to reality. And this is a rough approximation of the Christian experience. When we learn that much of our subjective experience of freedom and free will is a lie, and that there is freedom only in living by faith in God, we experience power and deliverance we did not think was possible. And Jesus comes to us with the ultimate red pill in John 8:31-36. If you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And then further down, Jesus says, verily I say to you, everyone who sins is a slave of sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So by faith, we receive a new place in God's family and we find rest. But just like in the movie, this freedom comes at the price of giving up the comforts of our current illusions and the meaning we currently derive from them. When Neo disconnects from the machine, all of a sudden he's lost the whole life he had before. That's the cost of freedom. And this is why Jesus says that we cannot live by faith if we do not give up all that we have. We can't be born of faith if we don't count the cost and make a choice that we want to be slaves of righteousness, no matter the cost. And so listen carefully, everyone listening to me right now. You don't have the power to change your desires. You don't have the power to change your nature, but you can make a decision right now by faith. You can decide whether the true righteousness of God is worth it to you. Is living by truth worth it to you, or do you prefer the comfort of your current illusions? That's the choice. And when you make that choice, everything changes. The fruit of the life of faith is that you're not afraid anymore of what will happen to you. Nothing really matters anymore except living by faith and walking with God. In Acts 20:24, Paul says, when he's talking about the threats of death that he faces, Paul says, none of these things move me, nor do I count my life dear to myself, so that I may finish my race with joy and the ministry which I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. And what does it say in Revelation 12? And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even to death. In Acts 5:41, after being publicly beaten, we read that Peter and John departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for his name. It's no longer about you. Life all of a sudden has this whole new outlook on life. It's a whole new approach where you're no longer the main character. In every situation, it's no longer about you, but about bringing other people out of darkness and death. And that's why when the mob was clamoring for prophet Jeremiah's death, he could say, as for me, here I am. Do with me as seems good and proper to you, but know for certain that if you put me to death, you will surely bring innocent blood on yourselves, on the city, and on the inhabitants. For truly the Lord has sent me to speak to you all these things in your hearing. So being a Christian is not this weak meekness that never stands up to evil. You become like Jeremiah, speaking boldly for God and standing up to evil, but it's no longer about you. You're no longer the main character. And what happens to you becomes much less important in this life. You can stop letting other people, the benefit here is that you can stop letting other people define your worth. Because these other people who are treating you badly, guess what? They're not free. They're slaves. So why would you take it personally? And this is how Jesus was able to pray. Imagine what your life would be like if you understood that people around you are not free. Not free in the sense that you usually think they are. You would no longer have to take it personally when others insult or injure you. Just like Jesus, you could pray on the cross that God will forgive them. And this is what the life of faith is all about. It's a radical commitment to truth. The truth that we are only free by faith. And that's true for everyone else. So why are you resenting people for just living out their natures that they can't control? You should be praying for them instead. Understanding this key truth is the most profound way to simplify your life and find victory and freedom. In every situation, you have a choice of faith that you can exercise. And it's the only choice that really matters. And again, everything changes in another way because everything all of a sudden is a gift. Because when you understand that, we're not these free creatures who get to decide our own destiny, you understand that what you have and what you think you've earned It's not really you that earned it. It was a gift. You don't get to be overly proud over your successes. You don't get to get too down over your setbacks. And that's why Moses reminds the Israelites, remember the Lord. It's he who gives you the power to get wealth. And like Paul, we can say that we know how to abound and how to be abased. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. So we covered a lot today. But remember the main thing, the most important is that we are not these free autonomous beings left to grind out goodness by our own willpower. We have one choice we can truly make, the choice of faith. And everything we do and desire will flow from that one choice. So my appeal to you is to stop being afraid and put your will fully on the side of Christ and trust him with a good outcome. God's love for you is perfect. Trust him. Trust him daily. Live by faith instead of fear. Exercise that one choice of faith at every moment of every day, and you will find rest and peace in God that surpasses understanding. And so the purpose of this series is to teach you the love of God in a systematic way by looking at history and the story of the Bible so that you may believe in the love of God and come to truly trust him yourself. Trust God. That is your salvation in 2 words. No doctrine can give you that faith. You have to choose it. And if you really trust God with all your heart, you will be saved from sin and from eternal death. And so that's my appeal to each one. And I pray that God help us and bless us to just comprehend, as Paul says, comprehend what is the riches, what is the length and breadth and depth of the love of God, then that we may be filled with the fullness of Christ. Amen.